Jews are being let into European society with the rise of the Enlightenment, the French and American revolutions. How will this affect their Judaism? And the conditions for being let out of the ghetto are to be part of French society. And these transformations will also impact Jewish religious life. Jews saw the need to adapt the religion to the modern world. And the first step was in the synagogue itself. In 1814, a group of progressive Jews will form the Hamburg Temple. And they begin with introducing the organ and the choir. And what we're going to see is that the changes at the beginning of the 1800s will not be ideologically driven. They'll be driven by practical considerations to make Jewish worship look more like the non-Jewish found in churches, more decorum, so they can be respected by the non-Jewish world, more in line with the standards, with the settings which Jews were starting to be accustomed to in non-Jewish society. There are other considerations. Given the questions posed to Jews by Napoleon to the Sanhedrin, whether Jews are loyal Frenchmen, there will be changes in the prayer book with the taking out of the mentionings of the return to Zion and Jerusalem, and the restitution, the restoring of the temple in Jerusalem. These will be removed because if Jews are now good Frenchmen, why would they aspire to leaving France? And in fact, that is the reason why the synagogues, Reform synagogues, are called temples, because they are saying that the temple in Jerusalem no longer needs to be built. We have temples here which can serve that function. Now, in traditional Jewish teaching, the synagogue is mikdash me'at. It's a microcosm of the temple. It's got an ark with a Torah in it, like the temple had the ark with the tablets in it. It has an eternal light. However, it was not the temple itself. And that's a fundamental change. Other fundamental changes will be change in the vernacular, in the use of the host language, German or French or English, for the rabbi to speak at first to the congregants, and then within the prayer book itself. And even though some of these changes might be within the purview of Jewish law and tradition, after all, there were musical instruments in the temple in Jerusalem on Shabbat, and the Talmud specifically says that one can pray in any language. Yet the adaptation to general society brought about a wave of other changes, such as the taking of the bima, the elevated area where the Torah is read. It was moved to the front of the synagogue, and it was turned around to face the congregation, like the minister would have his pedestal at the front facing the congregation, which also reflected a difference in outlook. For in the Jewish synagogue, the person leading the services is the shliach tzibor. He's the envoy of the congregation to lead the congregation together in prayer, as opposed to ministering to the congregation from in front and above. They also brought innovations of men and women sitting together. And these temples started to pop up in different regions in Europe. Associations were formed. And as we said, these were all adapting to the non-Jewish forms of prayer. Even the pews were designed to look more like a church. And these changes also started to occur in the ideology itself. where there was a reaffirmation of the ethical laws, but a question of, as we already mentioned with Spinoza, the divine nature of the Torah, and therefore the need for what one would call ritual law, kosher, Shabbat, were put into question. Abraham Geiger was one of the ideologues driving behind the movement. He originally was a student of Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who, when he saw his student veering towards too much change, distanced himself from that student. And so we see this push and pull of the desire to, of course, be able to come out of the ghetto, because ghetto existence was very difficult, was full of suffering, where there was oppression. And given the choice, of course, it was a very difficult challenge to say, well, we're being let out of the ghetto, but they're asking us to modernize. So what choice do we have? We can see how some might ask that. And yet we're going to see there are those who remain faithful to the tradition, to not changing Judaism, and to keeping the tradition as it was, and adopting it, perhaps, to modern society without getting rid of it. Now, there are those who questioned even the most fundamentals of Judaism, whether circumcision in 1840s, there were those Reform rabbis who questioned whether circumcision should even be performed, whether the Shabbat should be changed to a Sunday. And in the end, those innovations and changes were not made. But we see that at the inauguration of the first class of Reform rabbis at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati in 1883, they had a very elaborate banquet. And it became to be known as the Treif banquet, because what was served? Sea fish, crab, shrimp as an entree, frog's legs as part of the relevé. I don't even know what that is. I guess between the entree and the main course, such a thing can exist. Meat was served with dairy. However, interestingly enough, there was no pork. And reportedly afterwards, it was more of a lack of overview that the caterer served what would be an elaborate banquet and ignored any, or wasn't aware of Jewish dietary restrictions. But once it was done, the rabbis who were criticized and attacked for this doubled down and said, well, we don't ascribe to the ritual laws in any case, and this is something that we are not going to have to apologize for. And so you see this rapid transformation of the Reform movement going further and further away from traditional Judaism. At the same time, interestingly enough, there will be movements which will revitalize traditional Judaism, and particularly the Hasidic movement. The beginning of the Hasidic movement, and I would say beginning of Hasidism, because he didn't start it as a movement, was the figure of the Baal Shem Tov, who he lived in Medzubeh, which is in the Ukraine. And he started his career hiding his greatness and his knowledge, which we see in many of the great Jewish religious figures. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai hid in a cave for 12 years and studied. Rabbi Isaac Luria spent 10 years by the Nile River in a cabin. And the Baal Shem Tov, it's reportedly said, would serve as the beadle of the synagogue. He would sweep up, he would put the books away, came across as a simpleton. After everyone left at night, he would light a candle and study all night, including Kabbalistic texts, and his knowledge was encyclopedic. But yet he championed the common person. There was a feeling that Judaism had become too elite, that the study of Talmud which is very challenging, difficult, had become something that not all Jews could access. And the Jews who couldn't felt themselves like enfranchised, and that maybe their belief and their faith was not ideal. And the Baal Shem Tov brought it back to the people, advocating for Emunah Pshuta, saying everyone has a divine soul, everyone is created in the image of God, every human being has the ability to serve God and feel close to God and to pray to God in their own way, and perhaps that person with the simple faith is even greater than the one who is the great scholar. And the famous story of Yom Kippur, a young shepherd boy walks into the synagogue and wants to express himself to God, takes out his flute and starts playing. The congregants are all aghast, but the Baal Shem Tov silences them and says, how do you not know that his calling to God is not sweeter and more sincere and more heartfelt than all of the prayers? And I see the angels dancing in heaven and God being very pleased at this young man's prayers. So the Baal Shem Tov himself was a very hidden figure. We don't have any of his writings except for a few letters and a few forgeries, which claimed his. But it was through his students that the movement spread and began. And particularly the Maggid of Mezrich, who himself, one of his top students was Rabbi Jonathan of Liadi, who in the early 1800s started his own teachings, particularly the Tanya, which is a book about the divine nature of the human soul and how to serve God with that divine soul. And of course, he became the first Rabbi of Chabad, the Alter Rebbe, Chabad being an acronym for Chachma Bina Dat, which are the top three divine qualities or divine spirot, which embody three levels of understanding and emanate from the Almighty. And one of the signature distinctions of the Chabad, Hasidic movement in general, but particularly Chabad, is the popularization of Kabbalistic and more mystical teachings. Also, Chabad happened to be a more intellectual approach, very focused on scholarship and study. And the first Chabad Rebbe was one of seven until we got to the seventh Rebbe, who, as we know, did not appoint a successor. Chabad was always outward focused in terms of spreading their teachings, but in its early years, not as much as the Chabad of today. It was based in Russia rather than in the town of Lubavitch, rather than in the Ukraine where the Baal Shem Tov was. And perhaps today is one of the best known of the Hasidic movements. Another very well-known one is Breslov, started with Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who was actually the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. And he was also very enigmatic figure. He didn't start off as a follower of his grandfather, but he made a trip to Israel, which was seminal for him. He was a figure who was known to struggle with depression, to struggle emotionally, but that was the strength of his teaching, that he said no matter where a person's at, no matter how low they are, they can lift themselves up. God is close to them. And in fact, he championed serving God through joy. And that's one of the reasons that his teachings are so popular and so beloved, that people flock to his grave, particularly in the Ukraine, particularly on Rosh Hashanah to Uman. Here you see the picture of Uman right before Rosh Hashanah, where he told people, if you come to Uman on Rosh Hashanah, I will lift you out of hell personally. And so people go to be close to his grave and to feel like they're getting the blessing from Rabbi Nachman. Paradoxically, he was the first and the last rabbi of Breslov Hasidim, but his followers are many today as well as many other Hasidic movements. Satmar is very large, especially outside of Israel. Ger, Vishnitz, number in some of these movements, number in the tens and hundreds of thousands. And really, it was a testament to the Baal Shem Tov's feeling like he needed to reconnect the people with the fundamentals of faith and of God, give them a Judaism which was celebrated with joy, with companionship, not dependent upon involved and challenging scholarship, although it is promoted and it is encouraged. And it's not to say the Hasidim can't be scholars themselves, but the ones who aren't find a special place in Hasidic society. One can't help but wonder whether the development of these movements emerged just at the time when modernity was emerging as well, and in a sense was a counter response to the movement, because the assimilation in Eastern Europe happened much later than in Western Europe, perhaps 100 years later, in the 1800s. It was called the Haskalah movement. And many Jews were assimilating and were losing their Judaism. And the Hasidic movement was the largest group of traditional Judaism right before World War II and had the greatest staying power. Yet at the same time, in the non-Hasidic world, there emerged a great figure, also in the early 1700s, mid-1700s, Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna. He also was a child prodigy, was a great, brilliant mind, knew the entire Torah, such that by the end of his career, his writings are so terse and so short that he doesn't even write commentary. He just writes sources to look at, and you have to figure out yourself what he is getting at, because he assumed that someone reading it would know the entire Torah. He was also known to be a student of science and math and to be brilliant in those fields as well, and he embraced all knowledge and learning. And the paradox was that if the students of the Baal Shem Tov started a movement, Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna, he sat his whole life, did not have a rabbinic position, and through his greatness and his teachings, transformed the Jewish world. Because once again, it would be his student, Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, who founded the first formal yeshiva. Now, before that, there were schools of Talmudic study, but they weren't so structured. People would study from their fathers. If they were showing progress, they would go to a scholar. They would perhaps live in their house. But there wasn't a formalized institution. Rabbi Chaim Volozhin created the first yeshiva where students would board, where they would receive a stipend or at least meals from the local people in the town, and they would be supported to focus upon their Torah studies, particularly in Talmud. Here's a picture of the Volozhin Yeshiva, and founded in 1804. And this became the model for the yeshivot, which would give rise to many other different schools in the yeshiva world as well. And yeshivot, which would, particularly in Lithuania, sometimes it's known as the Lithuanian world, they were also known as the mitnagdim, the ones who were against, because the Vilna Gaon had his reservations about the Hasidic movement, particularly with Chabad, and there was a skepticism of whether their focus upon on other things other than study would lead to problems later on. Some of them more flexibility with Jewish law, So they were known as the ones who opposed. But today it's known as the Yeshiva world, and also a major force in the Haredi world today. Of course, both of these movements advocated not changing one's dress to remain distinct from non-Jewish society as a buffer to being influenced from what was becoming a secular world, which was questioning religion more and more. And so they advocated holding true to one's faith and are the core of what today is known as the Haredi world. Now, there were other reactions to modernity. Reform was go wholeheartedly into assimilating into modernity and adapt Judaism to it. And the Hasidic and Yeshiva world was stand strong despite modernity and put up walls to not be influenced by it. Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch in Germany, he tried to take the middle path. And while he staunchly advocated for being true to one's Torah observant life, he created an ideology or advocated an ideology where one could be loyal to that, yet at the same time embrace the best of what the non-Jewish world had to offer in terms of culture and particularly in the area of culture, poetry, music, literature. And as long as it wasn't against the values of the Torah, it could serve a purpose to develop the human dimensions of a person. And the movement was known as Torah im Derech Eretz, Torah with the way of the world. He also advocated that Jews should be able to function in society, to have professions, and to advance in their professional lives, of course, as long as they did not have to compromise on Sabbath observance, on kosher, and staying true to their observance. Because of the extreme changes in Judaism that the Reform movement, there was a counter reaction to that. And some say at the Treif banquet, two people walked out and said, let's start a movement and a school that will hold more to tradition. And so the Jewish Theological Seminary was formed. And Rabbi Solomon Schachter, who we already mentioned in his work with the Dead Sea Scrolls, was recruited to be its head. He was a big Torah scholar. He was a traditional Jew. Yet his ideology allowed for more changes within Judaism because his view was that Jewish law, in a sense, should be a reflection of the people's will. And so, while in his time this did not bring about many practical changes, by the 1950s, some 50 years later, as Jews started to move to the suburbs, rabbis in the movement advocated that, well, Jews should be able to drive to synagogue because that is the practical needs of this time. They would say you shouldn't drive anywhere else, but they wrote rabbinic responsa justifying why you could drive to synagogue. And in the Orthodox world, there was an opposition to the conservative movement, perhaps sensing that that subtle difference in outlook would lead to greater changes further down the line. And these were the different reactions to modernity within Judaism. In our next installment, we will look at the counter-reaction in non-Jewish society and the wave of anti-Semitism which will sweep across Europe as Jews start to assimilate into non-Jewish society.